We sent round a little spiel about you, John, on the speculative psychiatry posting. So I guess most people know a little bit about your background, and you've just outlined something just now. And tonight, you've got a talk here, which is based on, I guess, that paper you also which I distributed to, Neuroscience and Criminal Justice, Time for a Copernican Revolution. So I'll let you get on with it, John. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay, well, thank you, David, for the invitation, and thank you all for coming along this evening. So this is my title. I'll just try to summarize what was set out in the paper. The paper's been circulated. I hope at least some of you might have read the paper and have some questions ready to answer at the end. Start with a quotation from the Marquis de Sade. If there are beings in the world whose acts shock all accepted prejudices, we must not preach at them or punish them, because their bizarre tastes no more depend upon themselves than it depends on you, whether you are witty or stupid, well-made or humpbacked. What would become of your laws, your morality, your religion, your gallows, your paradise, your God, your hell, if it were shown that such and such fluids, such fibers, or a certain acridity in the blood or in the animal spirits alone suffice to make a man the object of your punishments or your rewards? So that's the question I want to address tonight. So I won't be talking about acridity in the blood, but trying to bring this up to date by looking at neuroscience research into criminal behavior. This question was asked long before neuroscience was ever heard of, and it illustrates that this whole debate points to very long-standing and deeper issues about really what we are as agents. Are we free agents with capacities for choice and decision, and who can act on these choices and decisions? Or to put it more spiritually, are we creatures of God with a God-given capacity for free will, or are our actions just events in the world like other actions, dependent on the causal laws of the universe? I'm going to discuss recent research in three areas. Firstly, behavioral genetics with a focus on gene-environment interactions. Secondly, acquired brain injury, and lastly, psychological traumatization. The genetic research into criminality goes back a very long way to studies using adoption, birth cohorts and adoption cohorts in Denmark back as far as 1980, and these have highlighted genetic factors as predisposing to crime. There's been more detailed research recently looking at the inheritance of so-called callous unemotional traits. As I said, what I want to look at today is gene-environment interactions. The big study in this area was published by Avshalom Caspi and colleagues back in 2002. The gene they looked at was monoamine oxidase A, and this is a gene that, as you might imagine, that is involved with the metabolism of monoamines in the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. There are 7 known polymorphisms, and these are divided conventionally into high activity polymorphisms, which are possessed by 63% of us, and low activity possessed by the other 37%. The environmental factor they looked at was childhood maltreatment. And this was a very long-standing, long-running longitudinal study that was followed up at ages 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 15, 18, 21, and 26. So what are the main findings? Firstly, maltreated males with a low activity variant were more likely to develop adolescent conduct disorder, but there was no increase in conduct disorder in maltreated males with the high activity variant. Maltreated low activity males more likely to be convicted in adulthood of a violent crime. but high activity males had no increased risk of violence. So low activity maltreated males comprised 11% of the study cohort, but committed 44% of the violent crimes. And low activity maltreated males had higher antisocial scores than high activity non-maltreated, than low activity non-maltreated males. Now, this study has been extensively replicated over the past 20 or so years, and the main studies are described in the paper if anybody wants to look at them. This is a quotation from a review published in 2020, which concludes the interplay between low MAOA variance and early life adversity is the best documented gene-environment interaction in the pathophysiology of aggression and antisocial behavior. How does this work? Well, this is one model, the so-called diathesis stress model. The diathesis or disposition is a characteristic that, if present, renders the individual more vulnerable to environmental stress or adversity. So they're worse off if the stress or adversity is present, but no better if it's absent. So the vulnerable individual in the graph might be the one with the low activity monoamine oxidase. The resilient one has high activity. If the environment's negative, such as childhood maltreatment, the vulnerable individual is going to do worse than the resilient individual. But they're not the resilient. Nobody's going to do any better in a positive environment. An alternative model is the so-called differential susceptibility, and here individuals are disposed to harm in the face of adverse environments, but will do better in environments that are positive. So this considers not just the presence or absence of harm, but the benefits of better than average environments. So our plastic or malleable individual, again, might be the low activity monoamine oxidase. The fixed individual might be the one with high on monoamine oxidase. So as with the last slide, we see the malleable or vulnerable individual doing worse in negative environments, but in this model, we see him doing better in positive environments. And this was tested in a study which looked at the interaction between plasticity alleles, so that's low activity monoamine oxidase, and 5 others associated with monoamine metabolism. The environmental factor looked at was maternal parenting quality, and the outcome was adolescent self-regulation. Now, each of the lines in the graph refers to the possession of 0 or more plasticity alleles. And what you see is that if you have none of these vulnerability alleles, then parenting quality doesn't affect too much whether you will show it doesn't affect your level of self-control or regulation. But the more of these plasticity alleles that you possess, the steeper that line becomes. So if you have 4 or 5, then yes, parenting quality is going to have quite a big effect on your level of self-control, not just in a negative sense, but also in a positive sense. So you will do badly if parenting quality is poor, but you will do much better if parenting quality is good. I think this has some message for how we might respond to criminals, especially young people who commit crimes. What we do in many cases is put these young people into environments that are about as pathological and poor as can be imagined, and often are such by design. They're harsh, they're punitive, they're environments in which people are vulnerable to being victims of violence and punishment. Let's move on to brain dysfunction and violence. Again, this research goes back a long way. One of the main pioneers was Adrian Raine. Describe a study published in 1998. He looked at effective versus predatory murderers. The effective murderers were said to be impulsive, hot-blooded, usually commit the crime in the heat of the moment in response to some provocation. The predatory murderers were controlled, purposeful, cold-blooded. So the criminal act was carefully planned and executed. The effective murderers found to have low levels of prefrontal cortex activity and high activity in emotion-generating areas such as the amygdala. The predatory murderers also had a high activity in the emotion-generating areas, but prefrontal cortex functioning was normal. So what form can acquired brain injury take? It can be a single severe injury or the cumulative effects of repeated minor injuries. And there have been multiple case reports of crimes committed after head injury or the development of brain disease, such as a brain tumor. It's well recognized that there are high rates of acquired brain injury in offender populations. Study by Brewer-Smith et al. Of incarcerated female offenders found 95% has some form of neurological abnormality, and violent female offenders had an average history of 2 brain injuries with loss of consciousness. There's been a lot of research on neural dysfunction and violence, often coming under the heading of looking at psychopathic personalities. One of the major proponents of this is a James Blair, and to summarize his findings, he sees violence as arising from a combination of overactivity in emotion-generating structures such as the amygdala and underactivity in areas concerned with self-control, for example, the prefrontal cortex. And there is a review paper that is referenced in my paper. Okay, let's go into traumatization and crime. I think this is important in itself, but also helps us understand and brings together the various areas that I've been discussing. There's one view of PTSD is that it's a hyperadrenergic state, and there's evidence from scanning that this is indeed the case. And this might explain why our low activity monoamine oxidase males have diminished capacity, are more vulnerable to crime because they have a diminished capacity to metabolize the success. So, these are people whose brains are swimming around in excess, noradrenaline, adrenaline, and so on. Second point is that environments in which there is a history of a risk of traumatization are also environments in which there is a risk of acquired brain injury. One example of this might be in military psychiatry, where frontline troops can be psychologically traumatized by what happens to them or what they see, but they are also at risk of traumatic brain injury, blast injuries, and so on that affect the brain. Children who grow up in, say, with an alcoholic mother, the child might have fetal alcohol syndrome. He might be subjected to physical punishment. He will have all the traumatization and neglect that can go with having an alcoholic mother and all that goes with that. And finally, if you do fMRI studies in PTSD patients, this exhibits that same picture of exaggerated amygdala and decreased ventromedial prefrontal cortex responses to trauma-related stimuli. And what's the relationship? Bessel van der Kolk, one of the leading lights in the field of PTSD and traumatization, says that traumatization followed by the victimization of others is a major cause of violence in society. How can that happen? Well, sometimes people get flashbacks to trauma. Sometimes these can be, frankly, hallucinatory. The person thinks they're back in the original traumatizing experience and may lash out on the basis of that. Traumatized people are in this constant state of physiological hyperarousal, the so-called fight or flight response. Often there's an oversensitivity to threat, known more technically as hostile attribution errors. So they're seeing threat where it might not actually exist. So because of all these factors, these people are often on a bit of a hair trigger and ready to lash out at the least provocation. More sinister development can be identification with the aggressor. This is summarized in a line from W.H. Auden: those to whom evil is done do evil in return. The child or young person who is physically abused or sexually abused can often be left feeling helpless or humiliated. He can look at his abuser and see somebody who's strong and in control and thinks, yes, well, I'll be like him. We maybe see this in some of the historical figures who've been responsible for murder and mayhem on the grand scale. Adolf Hitler was said to have been thrashed by his father every day of his childhood, once left so badly injured that his father thought he had died. Joseph Stalin was the same. His father was a drunken cobbler who beats him up mercilessly, and his mother treated him in the same way. And it's not difficult to imagine how that kind of background leads to somebody with a huge amount of anger and a need to avenge himself in a world that has mistreated him so badly. Another factor can be use of alcohol and other drugs as self-medication. As we all know, drugs will reduce inhibitions to violence, and in Scotland, nearly all violence is somehow alcohol related, but often in combination with some of these other factors. And again, as I've said, comorbid acquired brain injury. And sometimes people get into a kind of vicious circle of trauma, alcohol use, brain injury, alcohol-induced brain damage of various sorts, such as Korsakoff syndrome, and so the cycle goes on until something terrible happens. So there's found to be high rates of traumatization in both male and female incarcerated offenders. One study found that only 12% of female juvenile offenders had no history of traumatization. The Brewer-Smith study that I mentioned earlier found that 80% of violent female offenders had been physically abused in childhood, and 70% had been sexually abused. Okay, I've mentioned Copernican revolution, the need for a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift occurs when new findings undermine the old paradigm, and the classic case of that is the Copernican revolution, where the new paradigm of a heliocentric solar system undermined the long-standing geocentric model that had existed throughout most of human history. And Kuhn argues that a paradigm shift leads to not just a new perspective, but new observations. People start to see things that they just didn't see before. So much of the law is based on a pre-scientific paradigm, based on concepts such as free will, responsibility, good and evil, desert, retribution, justice. And I argue in the paper that these foundational beliefs are actually quite insecure, and also that this paradigm essentially has no explanatory power at all when it comes to criminality, apart from these metaphysical concepts such as good and evil. And I think this should be replaced by a scientific paradigm based on empirical research into crime and punishment. And that can be neuroscience research, but also research from other disciplines such as psychology, sociology, epidemiology, and so on.
Have other people lost the...
Hello?
No, all still good my end, David.
Okay.
I seem to have lost you. Oh,
Are you hearing me, or is it...
So I can still hear you and see the slides and everything, but it sounds like David's
Yeah, I jumped out a couple of times, but I was able to reconnect quite quickly.
All right, okay.
I don't think I've missed much. Yeah, just a few seconds.
Well, I just press on then.
Yeah, I think press on, John.
yeah, crack on, yeah.
Okay, now one question is whether the new paradigm is incommensurable with its predecessor, to use the technical term. And this is important from a practical point of view. Some lawyers look at neuroscience and say, well, we have existing doctrines of mitigation and excuse in the law already, so we can absorb neuroscientific findings into the law without the need for any radical change. But again, in the paper I argue that's just not practical, that the new paradigm must either replace the old one or just not be used at all. One way in which I think it is incommensurable is in relation to free will, and that's free will in the libertarian sense. That is the idea that we do have this power of origination, of uncaused action, and this forms the basis of retributive punishment. By retributive punishment, I mean punishment that is meted out because of desert, a sense that this is entirely appropriate in and of itself, rather than whether it actually achieves anything for the individual or society. As long as we hold on to this, I think it's a major obstruction to paradigm shift, because people can say, yes, oh, we accept he's got a low activity monoamine oxidase and maybe a bit brain damaged and traumatized, but still he had the choice. He didn't have to do what he did, and therefore he deserves to be punished. And as long as that's around, I think this is a card that can be played against any amount of science. And I think the whole idea of free will in this sense is actually a non-starter once you look into it and examine it carefully. So this is something that has to be pushed aside to make way for the new paradigm. The concept of free will, I think, is quite incompatible with the scientific worldview. And this is something that applies to us all as psychiatrists. What do? We try to work out why people do things. We do that on a clinical basis. We do it on a research basis. We want to know why people think the things they do, why they feel the way they do, why they behave in the ways that they do. We don't just say, oh, well, he just did it because he made a free choice to do it. We always want to know why. We want to understand. This is where we are just now. This is a picture of some UK judges. The most striking thing about them is what they're wearing on their heads, these wigs. This always, I think, is incredibly strange and amusing once you start back and think about it. It's sometimes justified by saying it indicates the venerable and traditional quality of the law. What we have is the spectacle of judges in the 21st century decked out in the garb of 18th century gentlemen. What I think this shows is that this is a profession that's stuck in this pre-scientific worldview. Most lawyers have no scientific background, no scientific training, and I think it's one reason they find it hard to take this on board. So why should we move to a new paradigm? Well, as I already said, there's a very high prevalence of mental disorders, traumatization, acquired brain injury, and incarcerated offenders. Secondly, prisons are already major providers of mental health care. One of the largest single-site prisons in the United States is Cook County Prison, and it's said to be one of the biggest mental hospitals, the biggest mental hospital in Illinois as well. And in most American states, more mentally ill people are cared for in prison than are cared for in hospitals. We have existing mental health legislation, which I think provides a template or a model to build on. Finally, we currently use psychiatric diagnosis to provide mitigation and excuse. What I'm really suggesting is that this gets extended. At the moment, we are faced with a crime and ask the question, well, are there reasons not to punish? And these reasons might be psychosis or something like that. I think we should move on from that and say, well, why punish? We really have to justify what we're doing now. I think you can probably continue to justify some punishment under this paradigm. There are some criminals who are really just rational economic players, people like drug smugglers, white-collar criminals, and so on. And, you know, if we want to control that kind of behavior, we have to create deterrence. But I think that kind of thinking can act in a very unjust way. And the kinds of people I've been speaking about, people with histories of traumatization, people with acquired brain injuries, people who perhaps have a genome full of these vulnerability factors for violence and crime. You could argue that the coercive management of offenders and also shares something with coercive management of the mentally ill is justified by the right of societies to protect their citizens from harm. There should be principles of parsimony and least restriction. Again, that's something shared with mental health legislation. We should inflict the least hardship on offenders to achieve the aims that we are trying to achieve with them. The equivalent of a psychiatric diagnosis might be a trial of facts to confirm that they actually did the crime they've been charged with, and that should be followed by a full assessment, and that could take forms such as this: a full psychiatric history, full substance misuse history, assessment for developmental problems such as ADHD, autism spectrum, dyslexia, occupational, educational history, histories of physical, emotional, sexual abuse and neglect, family history of mental disorder and offending, scrutiny of school and social services records. All serious offenders should have a full neurological assessment, full neurocognitive testing, brain scanning. Perhaps we could be studying genetic risk factors such as low activity monoamine oxidase, assessment for callous unemotional traits, and assess other things like literacy, occupational skills. One way of looking at responsibility in crime is just helping people become responsible members of society, and that can mean literacy, teaching them to read and write. Many prisoners can't read or write, giving them occupational skills, parenting skills, and so on. And finally, looking at social circumstances. And then I think there should be a plan based on assessment. Principal aims are reduction of recidivism and public protection. The present system is hopeless when it comes to recidivism. The vast majority of incarcerated offenders are recidivists, and consequently public protection is very poor. Secondary aims: improvement in the quality of life of offenders, reduction of the economic burden of offending. Public protection, as I've said, should be obtained by the least restrictive means. And if detention is required for public protection, the conditions of detention should not be punitive in themselves. If we are locking up somebody because we decided he's a danger, then we have no right to make that detention harsh and punitive. In fact, it should be about as close to what he would experience were he not detained by the state. So, final conclusion is from the National Bard, Rabbi Burns, that facts are chills that win a ding and dinna be disputed. What's he saying is the facts are the facts, they don't go away. I think the question is, we've got all this research that's coming on stream, what are we going to do about it? Can we simply carry on as we've done all these years and ignore it? I don't think so. I think it's time for a change, time for a major shift in how we deal with crime and with offenders. So I'll stop at that, David, and throw the meeting open to discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just one little point. I may have just been me, but I lost the your talk just for about 90 seconds or 2 minutes. Did anyone else have that problem? No, perhaps it was just me. Good.
I jumped in and out a couple of times, but it was maybe 10 seconds, and then
Okay, that's great. I was just thinking, goodness, we might have lost a little bit about when you were talking about the Kuhnian paradigm shift.
All right, again.
Anyway, so thank you very much, John. What I suggest might be better if we move to a discussion. Perhaps if you stop sharing your screen, John, and then we can all see one another.
Okay, good.
Might come back to that, but great. Okay, so if anybody wants to make a comment or question, perhaps if they indicate that by either waving at me or there we go, got everyone there. Yes, so actually Leslie Stevenson has already written a question for us. Would you like to just put that in to voice that up, Leslie? He's on mute at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, it's on the chat anyway.
I think it'd be good if Leslie could expand on the question a bit.
Yes, it's quite a big question, isn't it? Maybe Leslie's having difficulties with the IT.
What,
Oh,
is Leslie coming in, or can I jump in?
yeah,
Well,
come on then, Ian, and then
what you're describing, John, are correlations. You know, this behavior, this genetic makeup, these recordings from the brain, but they're not necessarily showing cause and effect. Would be one argument. You know, I suppose I come from my background as an addictions clinician, where, you know, the alcohol dependence, impaired choice over drinking or not, but then the answer is, in Alcoholics Anonymous terms, to make the choice not to drink, and then somehow you manage to do that, having learned that. So behaviors are malleable, and we can learn and mature. I know often, again, with the AA paradigm, you know, you realize you've done wrong and you try and make amends. So I suppose my instinct is always for free will and reformability of human beings, but yeah.
Well, I don't think my paradigm argues against reformability, and you know, I suggested that the major effort should be in rehabilitation rather than punishment. There are numbers of case reports which point clearly to direct causation. You know, people who lead normal, law-abiding lives then develop a brain tumor and start abusing their kids, and then the brain tumor's taken out and they go back to being their normal, law-abiding self. Then the brain tumor comes back and the abuse recommences. I think, you know, it's probably rarely, if ever the case, you could point to one single cause. It's usually a coming together of various causes. There's a very interesting American psychiatrist, Dorothy Otno-Lewis, who has paired up with a neurologist, Jonathan Pincus, and they've looked at people who commit the most horrendous crimes, you know, murders and so on, and said in every single case, they find this combination of childhood traumatization and brain injury. And the thinking is you need both. If you just have the childhood traumatization, you might be full with rage and anxiety, but if you've got an intact brain, you can control yourself. You're not going to lash out and kill somebody. If you've just got the damaged brain, you might not have the usual social inhibitions, but you're not going to have the kind of emotional drive to make you do something terrible. But if you've got both of these things, that's when trouble arises. It's also a phrase by Leibniz that all these things incline but do not necessitate. And I think we have this kind of human need to perpetuate some idea that we're free agents, that, well, yes, all these things occur, but trying to make sense of that is actually very difficult, you know, and I think, as I said, it can lead to considerable injustice. You know, people who have had terrible lives, who've never had a chance, just end up being punished and subjected to further mistreatment, and it just doesn't work. You know, it doesn't make them better people. They come out, they reoffend, they're back in prison. Complete waste of money. I would guess our entire criminal justice system is a complete waste. The most extreme example of what I was saying before that was I was actually at a webinar. It was a UN webinar. I just came across it and joined up. And it was about substance misuse and crime. And one of the cases was a young American woman who took amphetamines, went psychotic, and then stabbed her boyfriend to death. And an American professor was commenting on this. And the idea was, well, she voluntarily took the amphetamines, therefore she is responsible for whatever happened when she was under the influence. And he said in some states she could be facing the death penalty. I mean, I think that's just horrifying and bonkers. And, you know, I think that's the kind of logical extension of what you were saying, that's saying, oh, I want to maintain some sense that there's free will in there somewhere. And if you, as long as you can see that, then this is the kind of path you might end up going down.
Yeah, that's Roman law, which is the basis of Scots law. That you've committed two crimes if you get intoxicated and commit a crime, because you shouldn't have got intoxicated. Anyway, I see lots of hands up. Yeah.
Okay, but I'm sure it'll generate a lot of discussion, this topic, I think. I'll go to Chris and then Douglas and then David, if that's okay. So start with Chris.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for that. That was really interesting. Just a very quick first point, just for you to clarify. I'm just wondering, maybe for the benefit of people who aren't familiar with kind of the literature on free will and determinism, when you say, I think when you kind of reject the notion of free will, you mentioned it's kind of in a libertarian sense.
Mm-hmm.
It was maybe just to highlight that there are multiple alternative perspectives, and it doesn't necessitate that if you reject that kind of free will that you're advocating for kind of a nihilistic determinism, because I imagine that might have kind of sort of sprung into some people's minds. Would you be taking more of a kind of compatibilist type position, or in kind of rejecting libertarian free will?
No, I mean, I discussed the compatibilist positions at some length in my book, and if anybody's interested, they can look at that. It's referred to in the paper. I mean, there's a phrase, determinism goes all the way down. You either buy into this or you don't, and once you accept that human actions are determined like other actions, then I just don't think you can carry on as you're doing. I mentioned that, we have this idea of retribution, that punishment is just justified per se. It's the right thing to do if somebody has committed a crime. And even if that makes that person a worse criminal, you still do it. And it's that element of punishment that's based on essentially libertarian free will. And I think that's what we have to get away from. You mentioned nihilistic. It's not nihilistic. It's probably not fatalistic, though. People think, well, as John said, you don't just sit waiting for a brain cell to fire. You think about things, you make decisions, and so on. But these higher level processes, ultimately are deterministic. They're also chaotic. They're also unpredictable. So to disbelieve in libertarian free will is not to say that everything can be predicted, or that we should just say, well, what happens, happens. There's nothing we can do about it. We can engage with these things and think things through and so on. I think the whole free will thing is more of a theoretical issue than a practical issue. If you're faced with a difficult moral decision, the expectation is you will think it through. You're not going to just do the first thing that comes into your mind, and that would be part of the moral evaluation of your action.
Thank you. I have another question, which is the one I really want to ask, but I'm going to let other people speak first, and then hopefully, if there's time, you can come back to me.
That's very generous of you there. Okay, Douglas.
Yeah, no, I agree with your summary of neuroscience and causing behaviors, and it's certainly something has to be done about it. But neuroscience hasn't come up with reliable markers. I mean, the genetics, brain scans, physiology, and neurochemistry are all associations, aren't they? And about the only example I can think of where there is a good biomarker is epilepsy and automatisms, where it's a valid defense for a crime that one was having an epileptic fit at the time. But that absolutely depends on the evidence of having an EEG that's got a diagnostic epileptic trace on it. I can't think of other examples of behaviors that there's such a good diagnostic marker to fall back on, either by imaging or by any sort of genetics. That's all probability, isn't it? So I thought that's about the only example I can think of where neuroscience has contributed to a defense that the cause of the offense was biology.
Yeah, maybe I'm getting this wrong, Douglas, but I suspect your question is coming from the old paradigm, that you think, well, unless we can show some concrete cause and effect from one cause to the effect that is the crime, then it just shouldn't stand up. I mean, all causation is probabilistic in a sense that, as I said earlier, it's not a question of one cause leading to the criminal act. It's usually a combination of factors coming together. And, if we find that somebody has low activity monoamine oxidase A, that he's got a damaged brain from being battered as a child, that he's got a low IQ, an alcohol problem, that and so on. I don't think we could just ignore that and say this person just goes to jail and gets punished like anyone else. Surely we can do better than that and try and actually help sort things out. But I think we just have to regard crime as a problem to be fixed, not, you know, something that must be punished.
But you were saying that there are people in prison, like drug traffickers, who wouldn't have the defense that it's their biology causing it. There are, as it were, people that deserve to go to prison. But how do you sort that out? You know, a drug trafficker who may have been abused in childhood. I mean, how do you have to have some criteria to decide what if the behavior has been caused by a particular.
Yeah, I suppose the person might be somebody with none of these vulnerability factors, you know, who just is a rational economic player. And, you know, I think there is a justification for punishing people like that. And same with most white-collar crime. The paradox, I think, is that white-collar criminals get an easy time in the prison system, whereas these are the very ones who might be deterred by the prospect of harsh punishment. I mean, one way of thinking about punishment is the way a behavioral psychologist would think of it. A punishment is something that follows an action that makes repetition of that action less likely. A reward makes it more likely. And, you know, we have to regulate our societies. We cannot just allow a free-for-all, and that, you know, means having rules, having sanctions against breaking those rules. And sometimes the rules are important enough that the sanction should be under the criminal law. It doesn't have to be under the criminal law. You know, we don't want people to drink too much, and we control that by putting heavy duties on alcoholic drinks, for example. In the case of certain kinds of drug taking, we think it's bad enough that it should be criminalized, but that's controversial. You know, we don't really know whether criminalizing drug use actually helps anyone very much or helps society.
But if we just consider murders, I mean, how do you separate the drug trafficker who's committed a murder from the person who's had brain injury and trauma and childhood trauma and committed a murder? I mean, there has to be some distinction, doesn't there?
Yeah, well, I mean, do a brain scan, do neuropsychiatric testing, look at the whole circumstances of the murder. You know, I suppose in a case of a drug trafficker, you could see a very clear, rational reason, you know, for bumping off a competitor or somebody who's.
Yeah. I suspect neuroscience isn't clear enough for that. I don't think there are tests that yet. I mean, I think they will come eventually, but at the moment, I don't think there's one that you could do. But they would say this person definitely has that brain abnormality. You know, you could look at their amygdala activity or their frontal lobe activity, and they say that people with these changes usually have a tendency to violence, but you couldn't ever have brain imaging data and say that shows this person is liable, has committed that crime.
Yeah, I mean, I do sometimes think there's something fundamental about brain imaging data, whereas, you know, the relevant data might be actually behavioral data. You know, if this is somebody who is known to fly off the handle as soon as something triggers his traumatic memories, I think that's a much more important factor than, you know, what's happening by brain scanning in his amygdala, because, you know, you're quite right. It's a very imperfect science, and, you know, these nice pictures we see of bits of the brain lighting up are highly artifactual and based on groups rather than individuals.
And probabilities. Yeah. It's actually probability mapping, isn't it? So it's only a statistical probability. It's not a actual lighting up of the amygdala, is it? It's a relative lighting up compared to other controls. So
yeah.
So I think it's all based on that kind of probability rather than being sure.
Yeah.
But, you know, if an offender has PTSD, well, we should be treating the PTSD. We shouldn't just be chucking him into a traumatizing environment and 5 years later letting him out even more traumatized and dangerous to society than he was when he went in.
Yeah. I'm going to move because there's quite a few people I think who want to chip in here. So maybe come back to that issue. I'll be interested in coming back to that issue in a moment. But David, were you going to, and I'll go to Leonie. Maybe gone. There you are. David, have you got a question? You're on mute at the moment. Can you unmute yourself? Perhaps I can unmute. Oh, there you are. That's it. You're right. You're
You're not muted now, but we can't hear you.
Turn up the volume on your computer.
Shall we?
David's working at it.
Yeah. Wretched business, this, isn't it? Just while you're having a go there, David, if you want to come back to us, you do that. I'll move on over to Leonie, if that's okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, just want to say hello to John.
Oh, it's nice to see you again.
We were colleagues for a long time, and including over issues like this in Aberdeen in very early days with Eric Matthews.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my philosophical sort of abilities for discourse haven't developed a great deal since, but I guess I feel persuaded by what John has to say in terms of nothing stays the same, and things have to change in everything we, in all aspects of our lives. So, and I do think the law is rigid, unreflective, and reactionary, really. And I think there's, even though just because we don't have the answers in other areas of psychology, psychiatry, even from the point of view of human compassion, I suppose, all these soft sort of sciences and perspectives, it doesn't mean we should just, to me anyway, just leave it at that. And I do feel what John said about if we use everything, all the clues we have in terms of assessing people who, clearly have vulnerability factors in their lives and makeup, just simply investigating without making a judgment whether we use that information or not will give us more information, surely, about the clustering of these factors, and will surely give us more knowledge and insight into what might be going on. Mm-hmm. So I just think there isn't justification to do nothing, really.
Yeah, I think it's a hardline materialist approach to the problem, and some people might see that, well, it's explicitly against the standard religious worldview, for example, but I think it does promote some virtues traditionally associated with religion, like humility and forgiveness and so on. If you really get to know somebody who's offended, you have to say, well, if I had this person's life, if I had this person's brain, this person's genetic makeup, how do I know I wouldn't be doing the same thing? And the answer is you just don't. It could be any of us, and I think it could generate a bit of compassion for offenders and better treatment of them. And we know that societies where this happens, like the Scandinavian countries, have better outcomes for crime. They have lower crime rates. There's a close correlation between crime rates and the amount of punishment that goes on. And, the obvious connection may be that more crime generates more punishment, but it could work in the other way as well, that, you have a punitive, honor-based society, then you generate more violence, more criminal behavior.
And there is evidence about inequalities in societies. And you mentioned the Scandinavian countries where, being more equal, even though they're among the rich countries, still have lower rates of crime. Yeah. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say, John. Well, thank you for it was really stimulating and interesting, and makes us think.
Good. Okay.
David, do you want to come back to us?
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, sorry, I had terrible trouble unmuting. There seemed to be something funny with the microphone, but apologies. Good to see you, John, and many thanks for that. Try to think about free will and determinism. I get reminded of MCQs from a million years ago, in which the answers always and never
could be excluded. So I tend to try to avoid extremes. I do agree with you. There's an argument for moving the current balance along, although perhaps a bigger worry than the theoretical is the fact that supposedly we're already committed to attempting rehabilitation and fail miserably at it in practical terms through resource allocation. So it's, in some ways, it's almost the wrong argument, although clearly if we were striving for more, we might achieve a wee bit more. So that's more of an observation. Any comments welcomed. As an actual question, does any of what you've looked at lead you down any constructive routes in terms of possible drug therapy? It's quite different to what you were talking about.
Yeah. In terms of drug therapy, I mean, well, not really, no. And still, when people talk about neuroscience and criminality, they get into all this sort of science fiction scenarios, at least lawyers and philosophers do. They think it's all about, you know, manipulating brains in weird and wonderful ways, but I don't think it's like that. But, you know, there are some drug therapies for traumatized people. One I've been using a lot is prazosin. That's an alpha adrenergic blocker, which can often be quite transformative for people who've been traumatized. You know, it can just stop all the bad dreams and insomnia and flashbacks and so on and help them live at peace with themselves. So just remind, what was your earlier point, David? It just exceeded my immediate memory.
It was more a little bit of caution about a seeming all or none free will determinism. But even if we shift towards a more deterministic view, the bigger problem would appear to be the practicality of getting a meaningful scheme of rehabilitation in our current custodial system.
Yeah, I think it has to be a radical shift. I'll tell you I think as long as you're trying to graft this onto a system that's essentially punitive and essentially based on the old paradigm, it just doesn't take. I use the analogy of a skin graft. You know, unless you have special measures, the host will reject the graft. And I think you see this in prison. You know, there's a lot of cynicism, authoritarianism, skepticism about all these psychiatrists and psychologists who think they know what they're talking about. And, you know, you can put punishment out the front door and it comes sneaking in the back door if you're not careful. And, you know, even these environments can turn into, you know, harshly punitive environments as long as you retain that basic paradigm of crime and punishment. So, you know, I think it does need a major move away. I think it needs to be a much sounder concept. One of the biggest wastes of money in recent years in psychiatry was this dangerous severe personality disorder program, which squandered tens of millions and achieved nothing. And the reason that happened was conceptually it was rubbish. It was based on a complete misconception of what they were dealing with. And why do we get involved in philosophy and psychiatry? I think it's about getting some clarity about our concepts. Until you do that, you know, you just get it wrong. You ask the wrong questions, you do the wrong research, and so on. You know, even after all these years, do we have a clear concept of mental illness? I don't think so. Do we have a clear concept of depression? Not really, you know, and I think this explains a lot of why we fail to make progress in research and why we're not as effective as we would like to be.
We're trying to pretend to be proper doctors, aren't we? Psychiatric diagnoses have little validity, isn't that right? Anyway.
I noticed that Ian and Chris, you got your hands back up again, I think, haven't you? Was it Chris, did you put your hand up before Ian again?
I'm going to say yes just before I forget my question.
Elbowing your way to the front. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I haven't read your paper, John, about I certainly will be, so apologies if this kind of already comes up. I'm very sympathetic to your view and to the idea of the kind of the need for a radical shift, particularly with regards to the kind of way we conceptualize behaviors in terms of kind of these false binaries of good and evil and the idea of kind of just desert and punishment. I don't know if you're familiar with John Sadler's work, but he spoke recently, he's a philosopher but speaks a lot about kind of ethical issues, And he recently gave a talk kind of along similar lines, where he reflected that certainly within the kind of world of philosophy of psychiatry, we've got a much more nuanced understanding of the nature of mental illness. But he complains that in terms of kind of complex gene environment interactions, non kind of simple linear chains of causal events, there's all, lots of complexity and nuances, but he was concerned that hasn't transported to kind of the world of kind of criminal behavior or behavior more general, which I think is in keeping with perhaps what you've been saying. So my question is, I'm really interested to know what's doing the heavy lifting in your paradigm. And I'm hoping you're going to say that it's not the neuroscience, because my concern is that I think the emphasis on the neuroscience, whilst neuroscience can certainly be a useful tool, I'm concerned that if we rely on that too heavily conceptually, it could lead us astray. And I think that's kind of maybe been evidenced with some of the kind of questions and wondering around kind of brain imaging and so on. And I'm hoping that you're going to say that it's more about that. So I'm intrigued. Do we, whilst the neuroscience can be a helpful tool, could we conceptually kind of have a paradigm that would explain these difficulties kind of without needing to be able to demonstrate with, say, a brain scan? Is it more about having good conceptual clarity plus science in whatever form that takes? For example, kind of behave, all the other associations and not, I don't know. Sorry, that wasn't clear.
It's a very good point. One thing that might do the heavy lifting is basic economics. I mean, these systems are expensive and they're ineffective, and there's a growing realization of that we're just pouring money into a black hole and achieving nothing very much for it. And this certainly comes out in the United States. I mean, they've been traditionally said that the United States is 2% of the world's population and 20% of the incarcerated offenders, and that is a huge economic burden on the society apart from anything else, and for that reason they're trying to do something about it. I think it might also have the model have a bearing on primary prevention of crime. We know that we know how to prevent acquired brain injuries, for example. There's plenty we could be doing in terms of improving nutrition, making society safer, and so on. There's plenty we could be doing in terms of reducing the traumatization of young people and women. We know how to identify troubled families, where there's addiction in the parents, for example, or extreme poverty or mental illness. And it's well known that piling in interventions at an early stage for these families can improve outcomes, and including in terms of crime and antisocial behavior. So I'm rambling on here and slightly lost track of your question, but I think it opens out in all sorts of ways. It's not just about neuroscience, as I said in response to Douglas. I mean, the hard datum is what people do, how they behave. It's not what a brain scan is showing about what's going on in their brain. It's whether they do in fact commit crimes, whether they're out of control. And people don't want that. They don't want to be usually the kind of person who goes around losing the head with everybody and getting in fights and hurting people and so on.
I suppose that maybe one way of asking the question more simply is, if somebody had committed a crime in the context of significant trauma and adverse events, but didn't fit with our scientific understanding of, let's say they didn't have any differences in their brain scan, they didn't have the particular genetic makeup or phenotypes that are associated with those kind of gene environment interactions. If there weren't those things there, would you still want to be saying we need to be looking at rehabilitation and so on and so forth? And I guess that's why I'm saying it's more of a conceptual thing, because I'm worried that if the scientific resources that we have and presumably will have in the future are always going to be limited, and I'd be concerned if that was the thing that was making the decisions.
Yeah, I think the clinical information, as I said earlier, is probably harder than brain scan information in terms of resources. The present system consumes huge resources. And, you know, I think if these resources were redirected in a more constructive way, there could be a net economic benefit to society.
Thanks.
Ian, do you want to come back?
Thanks for letting me back in. Yeah, very thought-provoking, John. And so through your talk, I kept thinking, I'm not particularly religious or Christian, but, you know, original sin, the doctrine of the fall, knowledge of the tree of good and evil, you know, is everything predetermined in God's mind? If you looked at it from the theology point of view, and religion has debated that, you know, was Judas a free agent, or was somehow that predetermined to allow Christ to be, you know, so you kind of see it written on a bigger scale through Christian theology, but also on a bigger scale. And I wonder how your model would handle, because you quoted Auden, either that quote is about Hitler's upbringing, or more likely the Treaty of Versailles. So what do we make of Russia invading Ukraine and mass murder and the Holocaust? And, you know, because very much from what your motto is about individual action, but then when horrible things are done in the social sphere, you know, would this model fall down? Would it? I think it would be a real challenge to try and expand it in that way, you know. If you had Putin in court, how would this help us? You know.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And, you know, I think the social determinants of crime are very important as well. The book I quote is one called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. Has anyone come across that? It's a book about a police battalion in Poland in the 1940s. And these were sort of older men, usually late 30s, early 40s, who were, you know, too old or not fit for frontline service in the German army or the SS. And these were actually the foot soldiers of the Holocaust. We think about the Holocaust as being perpetrated by fanatical Nazis, but this was a battalion of 500 men, and over a few years, they were responsible for the deaths of 80,000 Jews, 30,000 by direct shooting and 50,000 by transportation to the camps. And what was remarkable about this group was their commanding officer said at the start, if you don't want to take part in this, you don't have to. You can step out and there will be no punishment or recrimination. But only a small number stepped out. So yes, there are these other social issues. We really have to understand how these atrocities can happen and how ordinary men can be pushed into doing the most atrocious acts of violence. And it's actually quite a depressing book to read. Don't read it unless you're feeling up to it. But yeah, it's a very good point. So yes, there's so much more to violence than just what's going on in the individual. We do have to look at the historical, cultural, social context in which violence is happening.
If I could just put my halfpenny worth in there, because I wonder if we're sort of returning back to Leslie's original comment, and I was just sort of thinking about the a very broad context here, which is about the idea of the good, and because what I find your presentation in one way marvelously generous. It's a generous view. And saying that we really ought to be able to take a therapeutic view of the issue of violence, and I'm absolutely behind that. But there's another part of it which I feel is there's something demoralizing about the picture, which is about what's the account of human nature that's involved here. Mm-hmm. I flag that because I think Leslie Stevenson is probably the same chap who's written the book about, or written a series, it's in multiple editions. I think it's called now 13 accounts of human nature. So you have a vision of the good, and I'm just thinking and I wonder if this is behind Chris's question about what's doing the heavy lifting there to tell us actually what you're saying is in this new paradigm is the good thing to do. I don't think it's just the economics. And I don't think it's neuroscience.
Yeah, I think I would take, I suppose, a non-realist view of concepts like good or evil. I think it's something to be worked out. And just going back to the wartime situation, the same group of people can be highly altruistic, courageous, self-sacrificing in relation.
But then you've got to sort of come back to the victims of crime and say, because they're going to be protesting about this, aren't they? I guess.
Well, there was one study done in the States of victims of crime and saying, what do you want to happen to our criminal justice system? And the overwhelming majority wanted money put into rehabilitation, drug treatment, and so on. They did not want more money put into prisons and locking people up.
But I think if you ask people about the particular perpetrators, they might give a slightly different account, mightn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes back to the nature of moral decision making. This comes up in moral psychology. When people are thinking in abstract terms, then they can usually be quite dispassionate. As soon as you personalize it in some ways, mobilize these emotions of pity and retribution and so on, then they can all get quite harsh and punitive about what goes on. I think there is an instinct for reciprocity in our societies, not just in terms of punishment, but in terms of, repaying good acts as well. And that's just what we are. It's in our nature, and it doesn't just go away. But it's in our nature to recoil from purulent abscesses or blood and guts and so on. But as a surgeon, you just got to overcome that and get on with it and do what has to be done. And I think the central purpose should be reducing the burden of crime. To be a victim of rape or a violent assault or have a family member murdered is just horrible, and people don't recover from that. And what we should be doing is trying to get that down as low as we can get it. And I don't think the present system does that.
I absolutely agree. Personally, I agree. We're going to have to be closing in a couple of minutes. I don't know if anyone's. Oh, Leslie, were you talking?
Yes, if I may. It's a philosophical question. What is the new paradigm? What does it amount to? If we take away libertarian free will, what is left? Just causes? Nothing but brain science, genetics, and early upbringing. All important, obviously. My question is, we all make choices, each one of us, for better or for worse, trivial or major. We make some of those choices for reasons, good reasons or bad reasons or middling reasons. Even I suppose that a fairly hardened criminal, so not totally mentally ill, understands some of what you say to them and can make perhaps trivial choices about what to eat or what exercise to take or so on. There's some island of minimal rationality and understanding that's left, and some acting for some sort of reason. What about trying to understand the person? We're talking therapy, or the prison visitor, or the prison chaplain, someone neutral who comes in and tries to understand the person. It may make a difference or may not, of course. Who knows? There's always multiple causes. But there's that whole dimension of understanding and understanding what people say to them and understanding perhaps some of the reasons behind what they say, deeper reasons, understanding the emotional context. It's all partial, and none of us are infallible, but that's part of human life. And hopefully, even in most criminals, there's some small island of quasi-rationality and choice left that we can work on.
Yes, there's all literature on moral decision making, why we do what we do. Jonathan Haidt has written very convincingly on this. His view is that we think we're not as rational as we think we are. We make our moral decisions and judgments really based on non-cognitive, emotive factors. Rationality comes in after the decision has been made as an attempt to justify it, perhaps an attempt to persuade people round to our way of thinking. it also suggests that we are perspicuous to ourselves. Are our reasons really why we're doing what we think we are? Are they perhaps there as an add-on to justify what we do? So you were a bit indistinct, Leslie. I didn't quite catch all that you said. Is there?
Well,
is that answering your question, or is there anything else I should look at?
You're on mute, Leslie.
right. If we take what you said as a universal sort of necessary truth about human nature, that whatever we think is a good reason for choice is determined by other factors.
Mm-hmm.
Applies to ourselves here and now. What we say isn't for a good reason. It's because of some unconscious stuff going on in the brain.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever get an account of good or evil. People can differ on that. I think it's just a constant process that has to be negotiated within societies. Compromises have to be made. I don't think there's a final destination for all of this. I think we can all agree we don't want to see our daughters raped. We don't want to be assaulted in the street. We don't want our houses broken into. You know, every society needs some kind of moral code. If we're going to live together, we have to have some ground rules. We have to have some way of ensuring these ground rules are obeyed. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there's any final destination to it. And, you know, I think there is disquiet. You know, we're throwing aside a paradigm that's been around for much of human history, and you know, there's unintended consequences to everything. And you know, I think this isn't going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, or maybe the lifetime of my children, or anything like that. But it has to start. One place it might start, I think, is with female offenders. I think one sees, you know, perhaps a more extreme manifestation of what I've been describing in women who offend. You know, they are much less liable to the kind of social and cultural pressures that come on men to be violent. There's usually, you know, more psychopathology going on with women, more brain damage and traumatization and so on. So, you know, that's, I think, is one place we could begin and see how it goes.
I'm going to draw things to a close because we're just out of time, really.